I recently had the opportunity to read Napoleon's notebooks. The owner of this fascinating volume lent it to me for a short time because he was about to set off on a long trip from which, in fact, he never returned. Despite the hurried reading, I enjoyed thoroughly the daring sketches and the surprising thoughts and imagination of this amazing man. In these pages, Napoleon appeared exactly as he had on the battlefield, a truly original personality of giant intellect. Alas, however, perhaps relying too much on the credulity of his readers, he tends to describe both circumstances and events in a particular light, not wishing to see things as they really were. It may be that he felt that this was the surest way, at least in the beginning, to capture people's minds and harness them to the victor's chariot. But being a poet at heart, he fell victim to his own flights of fancy, and gradually convinced himself of the truth of these false assertions, which he had made in order to mislead others. He would have done this in much the same way as Rousseau fell in love with an idealized Julie, as a real person who adored him, or as Tasso became passionately convinced that the battle fought for Jerusalem unfolded exactly as he imagined it in his immortal work. I may be wrong, but truth and credibility seem to be more on my side. Here are incontrovertible facts that are known to the whole world. Yet look at the determination and impatience, almost annoyance, with which Napoleon contradicts in his notes the incontrovertible proofs and facts that are known to the whole world. A candid account does not warrant getting into such fits. Whatever the motive may be for littering this treasure trove of military and political observations with unfounded descriptions, it cannot justify the results. We are bound to witness, with some surprise, how this new historian goes about disputing and demolishing the accounts of the feats of arms performed by the armies and commanders who opposed him, and finally comes around to the accomplishments of Russian partisans. He says, for example, not one sick man, not one laggard, not one messenger, not one transport was seized during the course of this campaign from Mainz to Moscow. Not a day went by that we did not receive news from France, and not a day went by that Paris did not receive letters from our army. 14 pages further on, he adds, during our march on Moscow, I never had enemy forces in our rear. All the time during my 20-day stay in this capital, not one messenger, not one munitions transport was intercepted. Not one fortified relay station was attacked. Artillery and military transports reached their destination unhindered. Finally, 7 pages later, he addresses the same subject and repeats, during the campaigns of Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, and Moscow, not one messenger was intercepted. Not one transport with sick soldiers was seized. Not a day went by that General Headquarters was left without news from Paris. Words dropped from such Olympian heights no longer represent the irritable hissing of mediocrities who have been criticizing our partisans for quite some time. These are thunderbolts tossed by Jupiter, and their rumbling sounds may have a lasting effect on public opinion, just as so many erroneous traditions have taken root in the minds of those too indifferent and lazy to investigate the facts, preferring to repeat carelessly the opinions uttered by others. Because I am one of the accused, a sense of honor prompts me to refute the injustice of such terrible, crushing pronouncements. Like a new Leonidas, I must face the masses led by Xerxes. My opinion of service as a partisan may not be as glowing as that of some of my compatriots, but it has never descended to the level of scorn. I feel, in a sense, that I was born solely to play a role in the fateful year of 1812, but much in the same manner as a rank-and-file soldier firing blindly amid the smoke and confusion of the Battle of Borodino. I have killed a dozen Frenchmen. No matter how much knowledge and talent were at my disposal, it was fate, just the same, which decided to diminish the enemy army by a dozen men and thereby to contribute to its eventual destruction by my comrades. That is how I visualize my own contribution to the weakening of the enemy forces, according to the means offered to me by my superiors and the gifts bestowed on me by nature. Napoleon and his countrymen may be permitted to curse me for the blood of his soldiers that I have spilled, but he should not deny me my feats of arms, nor presume to wipe away the blood splattered on my sword, those honorable stains for which I paid with my exertions. I accepted the constant risk of losing my life. This belongs to me. This is my plot in my country's field of glory. It is all the more dear to me because it alone stands out in my life, which was barren during my youth and devoid of distinction in my declining years. How, though, am I to defend what is mine? Am I to publicize the ephemeral lines of my own notebooks in the hope that they will outweigh the impressions made in the minds of the public by this extraordinary man? That would be the height of impertinence, laughable and futile. And who will bother to read an account which may be deemed to be pure invention when the brand of refutation blazes on every page of his writings? Who will undertake to disprove the accusations that have been made about the activities of our partisans by presenting arguments that are more convincing than those leveled against them? There are 5 main sources for these various statements. First, the official bulletins of the French army, which, as we know, were composed by Napoleon himself. Second, the Moniteur, which was the only official gazette of the French government. Third, the letters of Marshal Berthier to the various corps commanders. Fourth, the captured enemy documents which are preserved in the archives of the imperial headquarters. And fifth, the descriptions of the Russian campaign by certain writers whose sympathies are in no sense with the Russian cause. Once we have located these documents, we can publicize our own notes. The campaign of 1807. Let us deal first with the above-mentioned statement by Napoleon to the effect that during the campaigns of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland, not one messenger was intercepted, not one transport with sick soldiers was seized, and not a day passed without news being received from Paris. It is true that in the course of the Austerlitz and Jena campaigns, there was no report of a single partisan attack. I assume that the reason for this inactivity was that the Austrian and Prussian commanders were stunned by the decisive defeats inflicted upon them at the outset of both campaigns. This moral paralysis affected even the bravest of soldiers, to the point that Blücher himself, together with other Prussian generals, unabashedly laid down their arms at Ratkau. With more than 43 battalions and 64 squadrons under their command, in the event of imminent peril, they could have headed for Hamburg or Lauenburg, crossed the Elbe, and continued to wage partisan warfare and inflict considerable damage on the enemy forces. I am convinced that if the Battle of Jena had been postponed for sufficiently long to allow the Prussian army an opportunity to consider other military options, not only Blücher, but even other rather less resolute and resourceful generals would have adopted such desperate tactics and reaped an unexpected advantage for their country. Be that as it may, however, Napoleon's comments regarding partisan warfare in relation to the campaigns of Austerlitz and Jena are justified and do not raise the least objection. Nevertheless, the same does not hold true in respect of the campaign of Friedland, which I refer to as the campaign of 1807 in East Prussia. Here, from the very beginning, the Russian army confronted the enemy with fierce determination. At Pultusk, it repulsed part of Napoleon's army and fell back only because the battle was not fought at a location that suited us. At that moment, the main forces of the French army were not directed at Pultusk, but were aimed at Plotsk and Thorn. Facing this threat, the right flank of our army was deployed at Golomin and Makoy. So whether we succeeded or failed, we could not remain at Pultusk, let alone think of pursuing towards Warsaw the French troops we had just repulsed. Moreover, the least delay or slightest movement along the border of eastern Galicia, which was then under Austrian rule, would entail losing communications with Russia or the need to violate the border of a neutral power. This consideration prompted Bennigsen to fall back immediately and transfer the theater of operations to the confines of ancient Prussia. This turned out to be the wrong choice, although somewhat remedied when we intercepted Napoleon's courier sent to Bernadotte, whom our army pursued towards Thorn. This led to the concentration of forces at Yankovo and the battle at Eylau, a hard-fought but indecisive engagement after which both sides claimed victory. We, because we had retained possession of the battlefield, and the French because the Russian army subsequently fell back on Königsberg. In fact, the French victory at Friedland was the enemy's only success during this campaign. But before this unfortunate event, a number of particular engagements gave a chance for our light troops to become accustomed to the ups and downs of military life, and provided a form of active training that continued for almost half a year. Unexpected local successes encouraged us to undertake daring operations that were based on careful thought and observation, experience and habit, and which truly came into the category of partisan warfare. They were not the result of high command planning, but of individual inspiration and impulse. The trouble was that they tended to be isolated and unrelated, rather than part and parcel of a unified policy that demanded a joint effort in a perceived common cause. At this stage, the ultimate objective was concealed from commanders and troops alike. It was only after the passage of time, following disastrous setbacks in the Russian heartland itself, that the imminent peril to our country was fully recognized, and all our efforts were concentrated upon national salvation. Only then did we discern the advantages to be gained by the organization of light troops in small parties to attack enemy communications and supply lines, which had become overextended and highly vulnerable, was a key strategy. To sum up, I fully accept that partisan raids carried out during 1807 were not influenced or inspired by our high command, but I cannot agree with the assertion that such raids never took place. The Moniteur and the official bulletins, archives of truth when it comes to admitting setbacks suffered by the French army, will no doubt protest at my lack of fairness. And of course, Napoleon's own notes, taking full account of the importance of official dispatches intercepted during this campaign, will report in his own words the distress that the army would have suffered in the event of these dispatches failing to reach their destination. These will also serve as a valuable tool, for they will contradict the very assertions made in the book that I myself am challenging. Let us begin with Napoleon's notes and then call as witnesses the official Moniteur and the army bulletins. He writes, "After the battle near Pultusk in December 1806, the commander of the Russian army, General Bennigsen, marched towards the lower Vistula to attack Marshal Prince of Pontecorvo, Bernadotte, who had occupied Elbing. Napoleon left Warsaw on 27 January 1807, concentrating the army forces at Willenburg, and moved against the left flank of the Russians, intending to throw them back on Frisch's half. Snow and ice covered the ground. Bennigsen's army was in grave danger. The French army had reached the rear of the Russians when suddenly Cossack troops seized an officer from the main headquarters of the Prince of Neuchâtel, Berthier. The dispatches that were found on him informed Bennigsen of this troop movement. Bennigsen, thoroughly alarmed, quickly moved towards Allenstein. The Moniteur version of these events is as follows. The French army had not yet begun to move. All the other corps remained in their winter quarters in complete safety. It postponed action until the enemy's movements became more clearly defined, fearing that the least action might draw attention to the dangers to which the enemy could become exposed at any moment. With each passing day, the intentions of the Russians became increasingly clear. In time, the danger that was looming became evident, and Bennigsen gained an 8-hour start. This enabled him to arrive at Allenstein on the 3rd of February with his entire army, fully prepared to encounter the French army, which was headed in that direction. This turn of events was at first inexplicable, but the reason was discovered the following day when it was learned that the officer in question had been taken prisoner and had no time to burn the dispatches. The Moniteur concludes its article by repeating, "The enemy would have been destroyed if the officer sent to the Prince of Pontecorvo had burned the dispatches he was carrying. Everything had been calculated for the enemy to remain in the dark for another 8 hours concerning the moves revealed by these dispatches. The Russian army escaped destruction through circumstances entirely dependent on luck. This is a reminder that luck may intervene in all plans and events, and that whereas decisive actions that destroy an army and change the course of a campaign may be the fruits of experience and genius, they have to be accompanied by such whims of chance. A courier carrying such information is worth 100 bearers of news comprising Parisian gossip or empty chatter from the Palais Royal. During the course of this campaign, other couriers were seized, among them Montesquieu, the famous orderly of the French emperor, but since they are not mentioned in the official records, I will not dwell on them. As for the sick soldiers, it is known that during the attack on the corps of Marshal Ney, on the 5th of June near Gutstadt, and on the 6th near Ankendorf, not only the sick men, but also the carts, the park, the chancellery, and the marshal's own carriages were seized as a prize by Platov's Cossacks, who had swum across the Alais and the Passarge rivers. The proof that they actually penetrated the enemy rear is contained in bulletin number 78 of the French army, dated 12th June 1807, Heilsberg, which describes the action near Ankendorf. Our losses were 160 men killed, 200 wounded, and 250 taken prisoner. Most of these were seized by the Cossacks, who, in the morning before the attack, had penetrated the rear of the army. They bypassed Ostrada and entered Lobau. Then, at a signal from the French main headquarters, the troops were mobilized and advanced on the enemy's left flank, intending to threaten their rear. But in wartime, unforeseen circumstances arise. An officer detached from the main headquarters had been dispatched to the Prince of Pontecorvo with a detailed account of the movements of the French army, informing him of the emperor's intentions and instructing him to fall back as far as Thorn to lure the enemy even further. This order was seized by Cossacks, and the Russian general learned in time of the looming danger, thus gaining an 8-hour advantage. From this, we see that Platov's detachment, consisting of 10 Cossack regiments, the Pavlograd Hussar Regiment, and the 1st Jaeger Regiment, together with 12 horse-drawn artillery pieces, had overrun the rear of the 14,000-strong corps that was eventually attacked from 3 different directions by an army of 80,000 men. I challenge any soldier. Would Platov refrain from capturing all that was so conveniently there for the taking? Furthermore, given that Platov's detachment seized all the important documents, now in Bennigsen's archives, from the corps and, according to the bulletin's own admission, took 250 able-bodied prisoners, is it likely that the sick men would have escaped the same fate? The suddenness of the raid by the Hetman's flying corps would no more have given the French the chance to find a safe haven for these men than to relocate the artillery parks and supply wagons that were also captured. But why play with words? Napoleon's intention is clear. When he talks about the unimpeded progress of his messengers and the absolute safety of the sick men, it is not so much their welfare that concerns him, but the need to prove that during the course of this campaign, all his rear dispositions remained inviolate, and that our troops were unable to seize anything in those areas. The following is also relevant. Bulletin number 53, 22nd January 1807, Warsaw, reports that General Victor, in charge of the army's 2nd Corps, while traveling to Stettin, was seized with his adjutant by a party of 25 hussars who were conducting searches in this area. And Bulletin number 60, 17th February 1807, Eylau, states, in the region of Willenberg, 3,000 Russian prisoners were freed by a party consisting of 1,000 Cossacks. This is incorrect. The prisoners were set free not by Cossacks, but by the Kiev Dragoon Regiment commanded by Major General Lvov, who was sent for that express purpose from the Sedmoratsky detachment which had occupied Johannesburg. He arrived in the enemy's rear when their army moved towards Eylau and managed to free not 3,000 but 5,000 Russian and Prussian prisoners who were being taken to Warsaw, bringing them back safely to Johannesburg. Here is another instance to support my case. On 25th of January, Bernadotte had beaten our vanguard at Morungen and pursued it late into the night towards Liebstadt, giving no thought to Lucken, the first village which remained in the rear of the victorious corps to be secured by their advance. Unfortunately for the French marshal, on that same evening, the Sum Hussar and Kurland Dragoon regiments reached Lucken. The former was under the command of Count Pahlen, the latter under Prince Michael Dolgoruki, adjutant to the Tsar. Noticing that the sound of artillery fire was moving ever closer to Liebstadt, Pahlen felt it would be shameful to remain inactive while others were engaged in fighting. He decided to move on his own against the rear formations of the French corps, but not wishing meanwhile to leave undefended the village he had just occupied, which might later enter into the plans of the commander-in-chief, he sensibly and daringly took only 3 squadrons of dragoons and 2 squadrons of hussars and headed at full speed toward Eckersdorf and Himmelfort. He arrived at Morungen late at night. It was empty of troops, but filled with heavy equipment belonging to the French corps. Pahlen's and Dolgoruki's men burst into the streets and awoke the sleeping guards, still basking in their earlier victory, with cold steel and musket shots. Our squadrons ransacked the town, even taking Bernadotte's underwear, so that when the marshal returned with his corps to Morungen on 27th January, when our army's offensive was already underway, he found nothing but dead bodies, carriages that had been hacked to pieces, and papers from his chancellery scattered about by the wind. Before concluding my remarks concerning the campaign of 1807, fairness requires that I do not ignore our own inability to extract full advantage from what was on offer, with the arrival of new masses of troops who had joined the army from the regions of the Don, Kuban, and Urals. In truth, with the exception of the above-mentioned raids, only two of which can be attributed to Cossacks, their service was largely restricted to guard duty and concerted action with troops of the line. This was completely at variance with their natural inclination, preventing them from displaying the qualities of mobility, enterprise, and ingenuity that characterize a martial nation not yet crippled by the uniformity of methods and regulations typical of European states. Platov's detachment, as mentioned, consisted of 10 regiments of Cossacks, 1 Hussar regiment, 1 Jager regiment, and 12 horse-drawn artillery pieces. Their assignment, until March, was to form part of the vanguard of the main body of the army. From 13th March to 5th June, they were stationed at Passenheim to secure communications between the main forces and the corps engaged in action at Naref. Then, up to the time of Tilsit, they remained in the ranks of the army proper. What advantage was derived from this? None or very little. They attacked, were beaten back, advanced, retreated, and finally fell back on Tilsit, along with the rest of the troops. But my God, what a fantastic opportunity they had to display and give free rein to their natural abilities. The following alternatives might have been considered. First, the majority of these regiments could have been retained on the right bank of the Allee between Zeeburg and Heilsberg for action as independent groups against the enemy's rear, exactly as General Lvov had done with 1 regiment of dragoons while the French army was busy moving from Willenberg through Allenstein and Landsberg towards Eylau. Second, at a later stage, rather than wasting 3 months in empty exchange of fire with newly drafted Polish troops in the area of Passenheim, troops which had taken up parallel positions facing them near Hindenburg, our Cossacks instead could have divided themselves into groups. They could have carried out raids, on the one hand, between Hohenstein and Hillenburg on the communications of the main French army with Tornau, and on the other, through Horselen and Prinznitz on the communications of Massena with Warsaw. Third, during the offensive drive of the French army towards Heilsberg, the Cossack regiments could have been launched from Heilsberg through Gutstadt, along the left bank of the river Passarge towards Morungen and Mühlhausen. And finally, while our army was falling back from Friedland towards Tilsit, these regiments, after first retreating to Herdauen, could have made a sudden dash from there through Friedland towards Königsberg. Such operations would truly have benefited our cause, acting in the true spirit of partisan warfare in a country that was allied to us, and taking the field against a tired, inexperienced cavalry, unprepared to fight off partisan raids based upon total surprise and invulnerability. Our men would inevitably have sown destruction and panic in the rear echelons of the French army. Obviously, they could not have held back the victorious progress of the great commander, but by diverting the greater portion of his cavalry, they would have denied him the resource that enabled him to obtain quick and decisive results on the battlefield and to continue the relentless pursuit of his opponents. Until now, my objections have focused on a campaign that Napoleon only discusses fleetingly. But I come here to another war during which raids and probes became an integral part of military planning by the High Command. The damaging effects of such on the enemy attracted Napoleon's special scrutiny. That concludes the 15th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.